Join our staff and leaders of our church as we journey through topics that inform, engage, and inspire the daily life of our church.
Welcome to the Roundtable with Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church. My name is Kathleen McMurray, and I am the pastor of Connecting Ministries. I'm here with my amazing colleagues today, and we are going to be talking about women in ministry.
Hi, I'm Pastor Abbey Maynard. I'm the pastor of Community Ministries.
I'm Katye Chambers. I'm the associate pastor.
And I'm Rowland, and I'm the minister to youth and families.
Today, again, we're going to be talking about what it means to be women in ministry. So, as we have done a number of times in the process of ordination and the process of our call, I wanted to invite us all to share how we came into ministry, our call story. Who wants to start?
What a big thing to ask. I can go, though. So I was called to ministry when I was about 14 years old, and I've been called to youth ministry since I was a youth. And a lot of my call story really happened because I watched my mom, who's a United Methodist elder and a second career pastor, go through the ordination process and receive her own call and take on her own appointments. And so that's been such a huge, heavy influence on me.
What about you, Abby?
Well, I was originally very actively against going into ministry. I loved doing youth events. I spent all my time, it seemed like, at the church when I was in high school. And in hindsight, there were lots of things that were little hints to my call to ministry, but I really believed that I was going to be a doctor. And I went to college very confident in that, doing my pre-med classes and loving a lot of them. But that first summer after my first year of college, I got recruited by Michael McMurray to do Ozark Mission Project, and I was the camp intern. And so steadily throughout the summer, he kept going, you know, I really think you should preach. I think you're going to come back and be on college staff. And I finally at one point just said, I am not coming back next summer. I need to get an internship that's going to be for my career, and I'm going to be a doctor. And he just looked at me and said, I don't think you're going to be a doctor. I think you're going to be a pastor, which just made me mad. But by the end of the summer, he talked me into preaching. And that was a moment that really changed things for me. It made me stop and realize that I had been making all my own plans and that I had not really stopped to listen for where I was being called. And I think that God really talks to you through your sermons sometimes, because that's what I preached about, was not listening enough to God. And I sat down right after it and I thought, oh my gosh, I needed to hear that. I haven't been listening enough. And so that really started the journey for me of figuring out what that calling looked like. But that was when I finally realized there is a plan or a calling out there that is different from all these very clear plans that I've been setting up.
Right. Mine is very similar. When I was about 12, I think, 11, 12, that kind of awkward middle school era, we had our first female pastor at my home church, Jeannie Burton, and I had grown up in the Catholic and Methodist churches. And so seeing a woman in the pulpit was amazing and astonishing. And I remember a little bit unconsciously, because I didn't remember this consciously until I was looking back at when my parents cleared out their attic, and I got all my old journals and diaries. There was at one point where I said, like, I wrote about Pastor Jeannie, and, like, she talked about this in her sermon, and maybe I could be a pastor like her someday. Did not consciously remember this ever because I had my own plan. I was going into theater. I was going into, like, I loved musical theater, but then I was going into directing, and that was my thing. But then I worked for a summer at OMP in college. And like you, I had Mark Lassiter was our camp director, and he said, I think you need to preach on Tuesday night, which was about calling. And I said, okay. He's like, I think you have something to tell us. And so I said, okay, well then. And then in the preaching process, kind of acknowledged that for myself.
That's really funny because what Michael said to me was really similar when he was like, I think you have something to say on Wednesday night.
Yep. It's amazing how that works. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, there's something really powerful about somebody else speaking truth and gifts into you that you can't yet see for yourself, right? So many times we have someone who looks at you and says, have you ever thought about ministry? In my case, I was like, no. I also had a totally different career trajectory, a completely different vocation charted out. And it was Jay Clark for me who said, have you ever thought about ministry? And I said, I'll give it a try for 6 months and see how I like it while I'm like figuring things out. And 10 years later, I'm still, still in love with it and continuing to live into those gifts and that calling. But yeah, there's something really powerful about somebody speaking truth into your life and saying, I see gifts for ministry in you, and companioning you through living into that and being able to claim that for yourself.
So you mentioned this idea. It is really powerful having someone speak into that. Were there any women in leadership or women in ministry that you saw, whether they were ordained in the pulpit? I mean, you mentioned your mom.
Yeah.
Whether they were ordained or whether they were in leadership in the church that you could see. I mean, again, growing up in the Catholic Church for part of the time, I didn't see that there. And didn't know that was even something that could happen until I saw G.D. Burton. But were there other women that you guys saw that had an influence on your life in ministry and your calling?
I grew up here at Pulaski Heights, and I remember watching Lynn Lindsay as a diaconal minister. And I didn't really realize and appreciate the power of that model and that example until I started talking to other women who were feeling a call to ministry, who had never seen a woman doing the thing they felt called to do. And I just I'm so grateful that I had Reverend Lindsay as an example and as a model, because I never questioned whether or not women could be in the pulpit, whether women could lead, because that was just the world I grew up in. That was the water I swam in from very early on in my life. So Lynn Lindsay absolutely is somebody who modeled that for me super early.
Even though my mom obviously has had a huge impact on my ability to just say, of course women can be in the pulpit, of course, because I watched it in real time. But I think really there's something that happens to you as a pastor's kid when your parent isn't your pastor anymore. And so when I got to Hendrix, I was in a totally different conference, watching Lauren Delano. She was the associate at First Conway at the time. That was really powerful for me. And getting to know Reverend J.J. Whitney is a powerful experience for any human being that comes into contact with Reverend J.J. Whitney. But especially on me to meet someone that was working with young people in a capacity that was ordained and not traditional in a church setting was incredibly powerful. So I think for me, kind of watching, especially as a young adult, watching women take on ministry in a bunch of different aspects was really neat. And getting to be in exploring ministry together with my peers. I mean, when I met Abby, I finally said, oh my gosh, another young person that's my age that's going to do this, that loves the Bible the way I love the Bible, that wants to talk about God the way I want to talk about God. And so those kind of things are really powerful.
Awesome. What about you, Abby?
I wasn't in a tradition that was against women being pastors, but we just didn't have them in my small town. And so I still very clearly remember the first time I saw a female pastor. She was visiting the Episcopal Church, and she'd come to play the harp. And I didn't get to know her real well. It was just one afternoon, but I very clearly remember seeing oh, there's a female priest. That was a different thing and a cool thing. And then, much like Ellen, going to college and getting to know J.J. Whitney, she was the first female clergy person that I got to know. She was the first woman that I saw preaching, especially consistently. And that was just an entirely different view that I don't know that I'd really thought a lot about. But it was just not a place that I imagined myself. But it is so useful and so necessary to have those people who get how you feel, because after I realized I was called to ministry, the people that I got a hold of were, I called J.J. Whitney and said, I think I really need to come talk to you. And I texted Ellen and I said, I think I might be called to ministry. And I think your response was, I knew it.
Of course you are.
And it was so affirming, but it was so needed.
So outside of women in ministry, are there other women in your life, women in the life of the church, that have seen gifts in you, that have had an impact and an influence where you could say, oh, that person really was important?
I think the women in my family they've always been very invested in the church. And that's a model that I grew up with and loved. I grew up on the front pew next to my grandmother with my one great aunt playing the organ, and my other great aunt was married to a priest, and so she was always involved in the life of the church. And growing up with those women who weren't, they weren't ordained, but they were very much helping to lead the life of the church, and that was such a powerful example for me. And my aunt, who I've recently stayed with, has been a wonderful encourager for me of recognizing my gifts and passing on some of my great uncle's things from when he was a priest to me. So now I get to carry on that family tradition in a really special way that I would never have expected.
That's really cool. My mom, similarly, is not ordained like Ellen's, but I did find out many, many years later, when I was graduating from seminary, that my mom had considered going to seminary when I was a baby, and she thought she might have a call into ministry, which I didn't know. Surprise, surprise. But she said she realized, like, I was little, my sister was on the way, it wasn't a good time, but that she, decided she could be a layperson in the church and be in ministry in that way. And one of those people, she's one of those church members that's got so many different hats on, and I saw just such dedication from her to the life of the church with singing in the choir. She led children's choir for many years. Music was a big part of our family, but my parents also led a disciple Bible study class multiple times, and I saw her interaction with other women. They had kind of this core group of friends with some kids that were around our age, and we grew up together, and these adults, Miss Joy and Miss Melissa and Miss Diane, also became these incredible role models of very strong, dedicated women that could, and that were influential in my life when I had some rough times and felt like I didn't know if I could talk to my mom about stuff, and I could talk to Miss Joy or Miss Melissa, and it was that was just really, really, really impactful to have those folks, those role models.
I mean, for me, so I have the mom that's an ordained elder, and then both of her grandfathers are ordained ministers. And so my great-grandmother Inez, who lived to be 99, she lived until I was 17, so I got to know her in my lifetime, was an incredibly dedicated pastor's wife, and not in the sense of kind of some weird subservient thing, but in a way that was very honest and disciplined. They had 24 churches, and more appointments than that. And in her lifetime, she did things like she never wore a pair of pants because she thought it was unbecoming of the pastor's wife. She never played cards. She never drank. And she lived this highly disciplined life. But she also was a person that I think in her own way would have gone into ministry if she had had access to it. She came of age in a time before we were ordaining women, but in her own way, she was the person that when people heard that the Browns were coming to town, they were being appointed there. My great grandfather was known as kind of grouchy and stoic and a Bible study, very serious guy. And the rumor that I am always told is that the congregation would say, "Oh, but Mrs. Brown is coming." We're he's fine, but she's coming. And I think for us and our family, we have inherited a joy of the discipline of living into being a pastoral person. And it has always been inspiring to me to say that ministry has a lot to do with how you treat folks and with the relationships that you build. And that comes with or without a title.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is I picked up a religious studies major in undergrad as I was just starting to dabble in in ministry. And equally as important as it was for me to see women in the pulpit, I remember having a particular professor, Jill DeTemple, in undergrad who taught the majority of my religious studies classes. And having a woman who also encouraged me as a scholar of the Bible, someone who helped me fall in love with Scripture, someone who taught me to read it in progressive, challenging, liberative ways, was also really powerful for me. She is not ordained. That was is not a part of her calling, but someone who really nurtured that love of Scripture for me is the first person that comes to mind as a really powerful role model in the ministry that she is called to. My dad's side of the family have been faithful United Methodists for generations, and I remember my grandmother being so proud when I answered the call to ministry. As soon as I finished seminary, she said, "I want you to come speak to the UMW circle at my church," because she was so proud to show me off. And that legacy, I feel like that's such a common thread for a lot of women in ministry in the United Methodist Church, is that legacy of faithful women in our families who have said, even though that wasn't for me, I didn't grow up in that generation, I didn't grow up in that time, I see it in you, and wanting to celebrate that with us.
Right. I remember my grandmother went on a mission trip to El Salvador many years ago, because it was when I was in college or seminary, before I got ordained. But she bought me a stole, on her trip to El Salvador. She knew I was going to be a pastor, and so she bought me the stole that I wore recently in worship. But it's amazing that legacy that we get to carry on and have the opportunity. And you're right about the Bible. Next week we're going to be talking about some of the Scripture, how Scripture is interpreted by some, and then how Scripture is interpreted more liberatively, I think, in your words, Katie. And so looking forward to that. Well, thank you guys for joining us for this first week where we're talking about what it means for us to be women in ministry. We look forward to seeing you again next week. So have a great week, and tell someone about Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church.